Go ahead.
More or less. Well, you use one of them for
I think I
this.
opened one.
I hope
I think
so.
I opened this.
Okay. You should be able to have some. Yes. Thanks, Betsy. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, thank you. I know it's hard in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, in the middle of the semester. Is that where we are now? They say we're actually at the 1/3 of the semester mark, so it's almost done already. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Garza, Director of the Texas Language Center, Associate Professor in Slavic and Eurasian Studies here at the University of Texas. This particular Texas Language Center Language Matters talk is particularly close to my heart because I get to introduce not just one of the best translators, especially in the area of ours, of Russian, but also just a very dear friend. Before I introduce Marian, I'd like to remind everyone on your chairs or around you, you should find this pink sheet that gives our continuing events through the semester, including the usual. Thank you, Marina Alexandrova, for contributing on March 3rd to our Global Voices and Tales from Around the World at Explore UT, where we have our students from various languages performing in languages, songs and stories and music. It's always wonderful. There are a number of other, there's a couple of webinars, our March Language Matters on International Women's Day, all listed here as well. And to remind you also that this summer, for the first time in 19 years, if I'm not mistaken, or 20, we're having the ACTFL, American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, workshops for training oral proficiency instructors here at UT this summer. Yeah, right, I know. And so for those UT students, graduate students interested in becoming certified, for a number of them, I believe is it 4 or 5 from each language, you can get certified or get the training at half the cost. So it's a big deal for our grad students here. So please let your home departments know that this is happening in the early part of the summer before the first summer session begins. Okay, that's all for announcements. As I mentioned, I'm really excited to introduce Marian Schwartz to you all. Her resume is a quite lengthy one, so I really want to go with the shorter version only because I could list off all of the major works she has translated, but my favorite here, as I say, is she's translated well over 60 volumes now of Russian classic and contemporary fiction, as well as history, biography, and criticism, and even fine art. She's the principal English translator of the works of Nina Biberova, translated the New York Times bestseller, The Last Tsar, by Edvard Radzinsky, as well as classics by Bulgakov, Mikhail Bulgakov, Ivan Gocharov, Yuri Alesha, and Mikhail Lermontov. We're using your wonderful Hero of Our Times literally this week in my Chechen literature course. Her most recent translations are of the incomparable, if you haven't read his stuff in English, you should, Andrei Gerasimov, including works such as Rachel, Yuri Mamalayev's The Sublimes, and Venedikt Yerofeyev's Walpurgis Night. Her translation of Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina was published by Yale University Press in fall of 2014, and she's the recipient of 2 National Endowment for the Arts Translation Fellowships and the 2014 Read Russia Prize for Best Translation of Contemporary Russian Literature, as well as being the past president of the American Literary Translators Association. Here with her comments on the art of translation, please help me welcome Marian Schwartz.
I want to do a little shameless self-promotion. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Tom. This is actually my most recent publication, and it's the first of 4 of the volumes I'm doing in Solzhenitsyn's Red Wheel cycle. If you want to know more about it, I'm actually working on the 3rd one right now. The 2nd one is done. And I know more about the February Revolution than I ever thought I would or would need to. Anyways, if you'd like to look at it, it's right there. As I said, thank you, Tom. It's always a pleasure to come here. I got my master's here, so this is home turf for me. I want to apologize slightly for the title of this. I wrote it somewhat in haste. I don't think punctuation is a microcosm of anything, actually. But it sounded good when I said it. It's a metaphor. That's what I said. It's a metaphor. Punctuation is the farthest thing from a metaphor of anything. Punctuation is just not metaphorical, at least not in most languages. there is an interesting Arabic exception to that, which I may mention later if I remember. So I want to talk about punctuation and sort of the practice of literary translation, using punctuation as a discrete field that demonstrates certain methods that a translator develops over time. I want to say that all my translation and this whole talk is premised on my belief, which is highly developed in Russia, in the fine Russian School of Literary Translation, and is somehow up for debate elsewhere. I have no idea why. That makes no sense. That when you translate for sense. And you translate form insofar as it conveys sense. Okay, so that's the bedrock. That's where everything goes back to. On a more practical level, and this is a question I ask myself all day long, every day, since all I do is translate, it seems, is the necessity for a translator to translate what is standard as standard and save all the fancy stuff for when the author is doing something that is not standard. This sounds obvious, except that often translators don't know what's standard and become so enamored of the mechanics of the source language that they mistake that for something that is not standard. So punctuation is going to be a very good example of this when I finally get to that point. And I'll say the third main principle, sort of general principle that applies to all literary translation that I adhere to, is that a translation needs to produce an analogous response in the reader of the original and the reader of the translation. So if a book is funny in the original, it should be funny in the translation. If you think a character is smart in the original, the character should sound smart. And it sounds obvious, it's a lot harder to do, not just because it's hard to write humor. I mean, I think that was the main reason I agreed to translate Oblomov, was because none of the English translations of Oblomov had any humor in them at all, which is ridiculous, because Oblomov is humorous. Likewise, in Envy, nobody made the little doggerel verse in there funny. Why? Why even bother if you're not going to create the need? There's a need for humor in those places, and how you create it may vary from translator to translator. Anyways, this idea of producing an analogous reaction is complicated by the fact that not only do any two translators have a different opinion about what's going on in the original text and how that might be created, really any two readers of any text, even in the same language, will have a different reaction to the text. They'll tell you something about it, and it's not the same text to them. Once it becomes part of the reader's consciousness, it's something new. If you put a translator in between that, it's mediated again. So there's a lot of room for opinion. I'm expecting to get a lot of pushback on some of the things I say today, particularly among the native speakers among us. This notion, not so much of identifying what is standard, but it partly in identifying what's standard. A lot of times translators have difficulty understanding that because they don't read widely in the original language. I tell people when young translators ask me about translating, I say, you've got to read everything. You've got to read journalism. You've got to read criticism. You've got to read history. You've got to know what Soviet speak sounds like. You've got to be able to identify those things when they appear in literature. You've got to have a sense of why this sounds different. And then, of course, the bigger task, or the harder task, is to be able to recreate that in English. And for that, you really have to be very well read in English, or widely read anyway. I won't say I'm well read, but I'm very widely read. It gives you a larger sense of the language. Of course, when a writer is writing their own stuff, they just write what they want to write. But a translator has to write all kinds of things that they never thought they'd have to write, or even dreamed of reading. And then they're reading it, and all of a sudden they've got to reproduce it. So the toolkit has to be pretty big to do a wide range of things. People who do only poetry, to a certain extent, it's a problem for them too, unless they keep translating the same kind of poetry. But if they translate a variety of poetry, it's, again, on the subject of two different readers, one of the great things about translating, especially about translating great works, is that it becomes kind of a triangulation. Every translator brings something different to it, every good translator. We're only going to talk about good translations, okay? As much as we can. It's really no point talking about bad ones. But good ones, even if they're eccentric, they're all going to bring something different, a different angle on the original text. Well, about 25 years ago, I was at an ALTA, American Literary Translators Association conference, and we had a Russian workshop. We had enough Russian translators to have a workshop, and everybody brought their own stuff. And one of the people at the workshop was Walter Arndt, the great translator. Very old school, extremely old school, in a delightful way. He was pretty old at that point. And what he had brought to, we're all sort of, oh my God, it's Walter Arndt, and he's just participating with all of us. And he said, well, I was translating Pushkin. And the Pushkin I was translating, I wish I could remember what it was Pushkin imitating Byron. And Byron was imitating Scottish ballads. So I translated Pushkin as a Scottish ballad. And I thought, first of all, well, he knew that in an intellectual way, but also he knew what a Scottish ballad sounded like. That was part of his education, part of his reading. He could recreate it. He had that in him to bring that to the text. It was delightful. I thought, if people are going to keep translating Pushkin, they got to bring something new to this game, and he certainly did. It was a great. It was an insight for me that you could do something that perhaps, if there were only one translation of Pushkin, you couldn't justify it. But in this case, it was fabulous. It was wonderful. He also said something that is also relevant to this notion of standard versus non-standard, which was talking about the difficulties of translating Pushkin. And he said, the problem with translating Pushkin isn't that we haven't read everything Pushkin did, but Pushkin hasn't read everything we have. So we're in a way contaminated. We're different people. Anybody who tells you, any translator who tells you, oh, I only translate 19th century novels with 19th century sentences, is lying, because they can't. Nobody can. They're contaminated, and anyways, what translators tell you they're going to do and what they actually do, it often doesn't match up. They tell you all sorts of things. Oh, yes, I only do it this way, but that's not always true. So the thing about punctuation is that it's virtually all standard. Punctuation is virtually all standard. It's full of meaning, or it's got critical meaning, but it doesn't change from one author to the other. They may use it slightly differently, but the actual meaning of the punctuation is stable within a language. Punctuation is notation that expresses the relationship between units of meaning, and Each language does it in some ways in a way that only it does it. The notion that you can copy punctuation, I copied punctuation, exactly. I'm thinking, you're out of your mind, because punctuation doesn't mean the same thing in every language. It may look the same, but it doesn't mean the same. The Arabic story, which I think I have time to say, I was teaching a workshop in Fayetteville at University of Arkansas, and there were a bunch of literary translators there and graduate students, and one was translating from Arabic, and she said, and I don't know if this is true, but I loved the idea, was that Arabic, the country that she was translating from was so conservative that there was tremendous censorship on what was actually written, but there was no control over punctuation. And so authors were doing like 3 commas or an exclamation point and a dash and a comma and just making it up. And I'd say, well, how do you know what it means? She said, well, I'm not sure. But it was, there was a great deal of creativity in the punctuation. The person who's disappointed me most on this subject lately is Lydia Davis. She was at Alta last year, and I was talking to her, and she said something that my jaw was somewhere on the floor below it when she said it, but I was very polite. And then I found that it had been written about elsewhere, so I feel free to divulge this. She said, you know, Lydia Davis is a writer, but she considers herself a serious translator. And she translates from the French. She did the Flaubert, and she did the Proust. And she said that this is about translating Proust, Swann's Way, she said, she follows Proust's sentence structure as closely as possible in its every aspect, including punctuation, word order, and word choice, which is like, let's just throw her out. This is insane. I'm glad you all agree with me. But I'll tell you why it's insane, since I love saying that. Aside from, I'll focus on word choice because obviously word order is only superficially similar. Sometimes I feel sorry for Romance language translators because there's this superficial resemblance to English, and it prevents them from actually bringing a text all the way into English because it's, well, you could kind of do that. It would be okay, but is it really recreating the original? That's debatable. The subject of word choice is really interesting with French because what seems to me she's saying is that she uses a lot of cognates. And even if they're not false cognates, even if they're real cognates, you have 2 significant areas of problems. One is that English has a taste for specificity. We want the most specific word for everything. We don't like it. One of the complaints against Constance Garnett was always that she would say that someone picked a herb, and she wouldn't say which one, because she didn't care. But we care now. Translation, the taste in translation has changed. We want scientific specificity. And French, and of course English has many more words than everybody else. So that's part of, it kind of feeds on each other, that we have so many words, and we like them. And we like to use the very best, most appropriate word. French deals more with general words, likes general words. And that has an advantage too, because it sets up connections. If you use this word here and you use the same word there, well, maybe in English it's not really the right word, but you get the association. So it gives French a tool that English doesn't have in the same way. And the other thing is that, of course, you're losing half of the English vocabulary, all those Anglo-Saxon words and Germanic words. I mean, you've got, if you've got the source language here and the target language here, well, that overlap between them is smaller or larger depending on the 2 languages. But what you don't want to do is leave out all that stuff that you don't have in common. So you don't have in common Anglo-Saxon roots. But an English text without them sounds like a science article or bad poetry. So all this is to buttress an argument apparently I don't need to make, that you should not be translating punctuation directly. So, given that, I want to talk about something translators do that maybe isn't very sexy, but you do run into the same things all the time in certain situations. You know, there's certain situations that you learn solutions to, and you learn how they correspond because they are standard. And you've come across and you say, oh, I know what that is. And you do it more or less the same way every time. And that takes us to the handout. Russian punctuation, I don't know if it was always this way. Russians just love punctuation. I mean, if you looked at the page of the Solzhenitsyn that I'm translating, from far away, there'd be all these lines and spaces and dashes and ellipses, and you'd think, if it turned up in an English text, they would just get laughed out of town. It's appropriate in where he does it. Although I was thinking about this later when I first was thinking about it, and I thought, I think that there are plenty of quieter schools of Russian writing that don't use the very kind of hyper punctuation that we see in a lot of writing, especially today we see a lot of it. I don't remember Berberova using a lot of dashes. I translate Yusufovich, he doesn't use a lot of dashes either. So some of it is temperamental because of the way Russian uses dashes. Anyway, so most of the punctuation that Russian uses is so periods in Russian, they're more or less like periods. I mean, they may make their sentences shorter or longer, but their periods mean you're at the end of a sentence. Commas, also kind of similar. They mean, they separate clauses, but they do something that we don't do, which is they allow clauses to be next to each other without a conjunction. We can do that sometimes, but if you do it all the time, or if you do it as often as the Russians do it, it's a comma splice, it's an error. English really dislikes errors, grammatical errors. Brodsky once said that. He said, the thing about Russian is that if you go along and you're reading something and it's beautiful and you think, this is beautiful, and then 2 sentences later you say, oh, there's a mistake. Oh, it doesn't matter. You get to an English sentence, if there's a grammatical error, just throw it out. We have no tolerance for error in grammar. So those commas, unless we can do it if we're creating a rhythmic effect or a poetic effect, but it's got to have a reason. It cannot be done mechanically. Semicolons, everybody uses those less than they ever did. I love semicolons, but not too common in Russian. Another problematic one is the ellipses. It's like when I first started out translating, and there'd be these stories that had "uvy" in it, alas, and I'd think, oh, I gotta use alas. And I would finally end up with one alas, and by the time I got to the editor, there'd be no alasses. You just cannot say alas in English and with a straight face. But I dearly wanted to, but I learned not to. But ellipses are used legitimately in Russian in different ways. They're used to create pacing. They often use them at the end of paragraphs. It looks excessive to us, but it indicates some sort of pause. So ellipses are not just used by bad writers. It's a legitimate form of bad Russian writers, but they have almost no place in an English text. possibly in spoken direct speech, but that's about it. M dashes, which you see everywhere in Russian, partly because of the to be, the present tense to be, but also I'll show you there'll be an example on the handout about this. I find M dashes to be very useful in translating Russian because they help keep antecedents straight. If you've got a very long sentence and it starts with the subject in one gender and one number, and then you've got this intermediate phrase, which you're very likely to have in Russian, that goes everywhere with lots of different cases and lots of different verbs, and then it comes to the verb for that first word. Well, sometimes you want to recast it, but sometimes you can just stick M dashes around it, and that keeps your antecedent clear. So the handout deals with the colon. I talked about punctuation a long time ago at a talk, and there was a Russian translator in the back seat, and I told him that he couldn't talk because it was a graduate seminar, and he could not talk because I didn't want him intimidating everybody. And finally, he was beside himself because I kept saying how little we use colons in English, and he said, George Bernard Shaw. I said, okay. It gets less and less relevant. It's not only that we don't use them, we use them differently. Really, there's only one use for colon in English, and that is to introduce a list. That's it. It may for an example. Rarely it'll be a full independent clause, but for the most part, it's limited to, I saw many things at the zoo today, colon, a donkey, a lion, a hippopotamus, more or less in that form. Russian uses colons in quite a few different ways. So here's these, if you want to look at the handout. So sometimes the way it uses it, and so we have anybody, non-Russian speakers, non-Russian, okay. So what I've done is I've got the Russian, I've got a trot of the Russian, and then a solution, or, yeah. And this is literary translation, so there are other solutions in that. Anyways, so the first one shows, and I don't think I have time to go through all of them, but sometimes the colon is just a period. It's just a break in our understanding. So you have good reason to hope it will all be over quickly. Colon, for example, all it took. It's not a meaningful use of a colon in English. It would be a period. All it took was one calm conversation with the screen turned on in your resume and showing your diploma from Harvard Business School. So we can add information in a subsequent sentence without connecting it with the colon. Sometimes, and this comes up all the time, and I see it misdone all the time, where there's a colon and an M dash. That's almost always a phrase that should be in two M dashes. And I thought about this because Slavnikova, who I translated a lot of, uses a lot of these intervening descriptive phrases. And she ends up needing a lot of M dashes to keep everything straight. And there was one story that, by mistake, two people, I and someone else, got asked to translate it. And so I have the translation of the story in two polished translations. And it's an interesting example. It's number 3. Mouse is the character. So it says, an attempt to try her luck in the modeling business was a complete and utter flop, quite literally, M dash. Mouse actually fell off the catwalk and landed at the silk-stockinged feet of the woman who owned the agency, after which she limped out without a backwards glance, slamming doors along the way. It's a problem. I mean, you can see, I was so shocked at the sentence that I did a word count, and it's 51 words to the 30 original, which is insane. And mine was, her stab at the modeling business had ended literally in collapse, M dash. She fell off the runway at the agency on her silky legs, M dash. And she left without looking back, limping and slamming doors. So this makes it much clearer. This is the reason. That's how English works. We're using that intervening phrase to say, this is why, this is what happened, this is the explanation for this collapse, for this failure. That's how English does it. I think it does it well, anyway. The dash in the first one really would only indicate a pause. It really doesn't give you any meaning. It doesn't tell you this is it. This is what the problem was, because it's followed by stuff that's not part of the cause of the explanation. And I don't even know what. Oh, I didn't say what it was. I've got the wrong handout. I have your handout. Sometimes one of the most interesting ways that it's used. No, I forgot to admit. Above 4, it should say because, because M dash is used as to indicate. I mean, colon is used to indicate because. Russian doesn't say because very often. And you can almost always identify an English speaker because I keep saying "потому что." I keep saying it. And it's so untypical. It's not standard Russian to say that. So that's what the 4 is. I'm sorry, I thought I changed that. Okay. Oh, I have them below. I just didn't move that example. Let's hold the cause for later because I have more examples later. So the colon is also used to introduce a subordinate clause, or what we would do as a subordinate clause. So example 5. Yesterday when I swore in a letter to my brown-eyed darling that I would plow my dishonest field for another 1.5 years and then join her forever and have a son and another son and a daughter with her and stay with her till death do us part, I already knew I had exactly 1.5 years to convince myself, colon. I told her the truth. Very unclear what that would mean in English. Very unclear, you know. And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure, when I was going over this, whether it means in Russian, and we have a native speaker here, whether it means what I said, I already knew I had exactly 1.5 years to convince myself I told her the truth. Or, I guess that's what it means, yeah. So it's convince myself that I told her the truth, basically. The next one, every time I run into these people, I get the strongest impression, colon. Everything you've been planning up until now with what you thought was diabolical refinement turns out in reality to be naive bumbling.